Hello, everybody. I'm Don Counts, and we're here with Christine Armitage, right?
Kristen Armitage, and I'm regent of the Kings Mountain Messenger Chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution. And we're here to see the Higgins Whitaker Cemetery. And back in January, Mr. Wayne Owens came and gave our chapter a program on this cemetery and how it looked before and after. And it was really a mess. And on his own, Mr. Owens cleaned up this beautiful cemetery behind us. And the only time he asked for help was when he had to have 2 large trees taken down. And I think, that it'd be best if you let him tell you all about it, but he sure has worked real hard. And so after we heard his program in January, we thought we'd come out and see it in person. And it just can't compare when you see just pictures of it to actually see it in person.
Well, we're in beautiful Lincoln County and about, I'd say 4 or 5 miles up the Shelbyville Highway up on the right as you're going towards Shelbyville. And it is a beautiful place. Who all you have here with you today?
Everybody that's here with us today is a member of our chapter except for 2 people, and they're prospective members. And we have some more that weren't able to come because they're elderly, not able to walk around too much. But we can take some good memories back and tell them all about it after today.
Well, this is a beautiful place, and one thing about it is you have a list of who all is buried here. I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about some of those, and some of those are unmarked, and we don't know who's here.
And we do have a real daughter of a Revolutionary War soldier buried here, and Mr. Owens will tell you about her. And that's one of the things we wanted to see also.
Well, let's go take a look at the cemetery. We thank you for all you do, and thank you for us being able to capture just a little bit more of the history of this community.
You're welcome, Don. Thanks for having us. Ladies, this morning we're here at the Whitaker Higgins Cemetery, and Mr. Owens is going to be showing us around and showing us everything that he has done, and the before and the after, and just all the hard work he has done here. And I'd just like to introduce Mr. Wayne Owens. Thank you for having us out here.
Well, thank you for coming, and welcome DAR. And I want to welcome my cousin Linda. It's good to see her. And my friend Jillian, who does research on the Whitaker family. And she knows a lot about the Whitakers that lived here and their ancestors over around Mulberry. But wanted to mention to you, another person I need to thank is the Beard family. Mr. Don Beard and his wife Sheila, they own this property now. And they've been very good about coming up, and they've mowed, they keep the outside of the cemetery mowed, and they weed-eated under all the fences yesterday for y'all, and I try to maintain the inside, but without them, this wouldn't be possible.
Well, you've done a wonderful job, and we look forward to hearing about all that you've done here.
Well,
so we'll just kind of mosey around.
Okay.
And look and,
let's go over and meet the Higgins.
Okay.
I'll start here since this is close. This is a son of James Higgins, and the young man was he was only about 24 years when he died. And he had just gotten married and had 150 acres up at Belleville. And he died and left an unborn child. And he was the son of James Higgins and Miss Nancy Higgins. James Higgins was the first settler on this land. James started out with 200 acres, and he kept adding land. And before he died, or before he retired, he had approximately 1,000 acres. And one of the plots that he bought was as low as 15 acres. But one of the things, and I brought it up and put it on his tombstone down here, straight across this hill is Mimosa. If you went straight east, you run into the Mimosa Church of Christ. And there was an old road, which my cousin Linda remembers, that we used to walk from our house back across to the candy store. And I was about 5 years old, and they drugged me back there, and I don't even know where they had money or not to buy candy. You remember that, Linda?
You got a whipping.
Yeah.
Probably. But Higgins and Whitaker, they owned halfway back to Mimosa. A lot of the land has been sold. They own to close to what they call the end of Possum Holler. Most of you know where Possum Holler is. They own right back to that place.
And so the Whitakers came in, married into the
The Higgins came in, and James Higgins was in here, one of the first settlers around 1808. And he, later on, about 1848, he was aging and decided to retire from farming. His daughter, Ann J., who is buried here, Ann J. married George Whitaker in 1848. George purchased 400 acres of the original Higgins farm. What I wanted to mention, if you notice the back side of that ridge, on the back side, there's 300 acres was the last acreage that James Higgins had, land grants. And it ran all the way across the back side up part of the Trigg farm up here was owned by him. But when I got the land deed, and I've got a copy of it down here, we were pleased to find out who signed the land grant. And it was none other than Sam Houston.
Oh, wow.
And that's something when Miss Carolyn Whitaker Crowley, these are her grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather and mother are buried here in this cemetery. She lives in Fort Worth, Texas. And she said to tell y'all that she would love to be here, but she's with us in spirit. And she wanted to know exact time we were going to be here this morning. So she's, I've worked with her now for 4 years, and without her, it's been a fun trip. It's been a fun trip. The wall was not built until around 1897. So the Whitaker family built the wall, and when they did, obviously the slaves were buried over on this side of the wall, and there's 15 whites that are buried in this area. Well, they were nice enough that when they built the wall, they enclosed all of them, which tells me they really cared about all of them were family. So probably the earliest people were probably buried against that far side of the wall. But the first Higgins, Miss Nancy, was James's first wife, and she died in 1825. So this makes this one of the oldest cemeteries in the county. And if you'll notice, it makes it one of the most beautiful cemeteries because they have markers. You just don't see all this stuff in most cemeteries. Now, since you're DAR, anybody heard of a guy named Joseph Greer?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
That's why our chapter is
Okay.
the Kings Mountain
Kings
Messenger.
Mountain Messenger. Well, what I wanted to point out to you, sometimes take a look at Joseph Greer's grave, and it's identical to Miss Nancy's.
It is. We've been out there.
Okay, okay. So John A. was one of the sons. Miss Nancy here was the first to be buried here.
Do you know who she was?
I do, but I have forgotten as of
Wasn't
this
she in
point.
Edmondson?
No,
No, she was.
no. James and his two wives, all of them came, James and Nancy came from Caroline County, Virginia. Now, Sarah and her father and all their family came from North Carolina, according to the records I find. Notice this, Miss Nancy has two tombstones. She has this one and she has this smaller one. Now, my guess is that this was her first tombstone and it was probably here. Later on, they upgraded and put this one in and just moved this one back here. Now moving on, someone asked about this grave here. I'm speculating on this, but I dug, this was totally under the ground. You couldn't see any part of rocks, and I was digging up a bodock root and I stumbled onto this. This was probably 2 foot under the ground, but under a bodock root. This one was a few inches on the ground. I believe this is a 2-year-old little girl that died in the house right up here at the Beards live in now. Her name was Sarah Hammonds Childers. Jill, Sarah Hammonds mean anything to you? That was John Jay's wife that we found his tombstone. So she was named after her grandparents. She was probably named after Sarah, as in Higgins, and Hammonds, as in the one over in Mulberry. But I believe that's who it is because she's lined up with the other children here. And she doesn't have a marker, and I know she's buried here.
Didn't one of Whitakers marry a Hammond's woman?
John Jay married a Hammonds, and Jill and I actually went over and dug up the tombstone, didn't we, Jill? And took a picture. So we may have one of the only pictures of, and that John Jay was a father of George down here. This lady here, she was 21 years old. Her name was Janie Whitaker, and she would be Carolyn's aunt. And she had some type of fever, and she dies in 1915. And they brought her out here and buried her on this place. I remember as a child, I could read the inscriptions, and I know this is her grave, but it's all just worn down, and but this is her, and she was, I think, 21 years old, 1915. This is a little infant of George Whitaker and Ann Jay. They didn't name it, it just says infant son of George and A.J. Whitaker. They misspelled the name. Now, here's a name that some of y'all recognize. This was most likely a stillborn. This is George Leffridge Whitaker. Leffridge. And let me tell you, he was named after his grandparents, George Whitaker and Little Berry Leffridge. So they're all family members, and if you do research, these names come up quite a bit. Anybody ever hear of Edna Rice? Edna Rice, her grandmother was Sally Whitaker Rice. And Sally Whitaker's first marriage was to this Childers boy. And he died, they had been married a year, and he dies. And he had one child that was born after he died, and he was named J.R. Childers. And J.R. Childers grew up on this farm and lived mostly in the house up here where the Beards live. This is Miss Sarah Winnings Moores, and I call her the original DAR member.
She's a real daughter, right?
Do we have that photograph? We have a photograph that we just found. Mary Alice had this, and we found it Sunday, and a year ago it would have meant nothing to me. Now it means everything. But Sarah W. Moores, his father, is buried in the Conger Cemetery. Mary Conger was married to Isaac, but Mary was a Moores. So Mary Moores Conger is a sister to Sarah. Now, if you do research, you'll know what I'm talking about. We found this because I went to the Conger Cemetery and I found Henry Moores, and the DAR had a plaque at the grave, but when you read it, it was put on there by people from Texas. And anyhow, we're going through some of Miss Ruth Morgan's stuff, and lo and behold, here's a copy that Mary Alice found. And this is
going to be looking for the original picture, is that correct?
Well, do you want to tell them, give them an update on the original pictures?
I called John, and he said he had the picture and he would let us have, it's John Bell, and said he would give us a picture.
And John's father is in this photograph, and the DAR region at that time was Ruth Morgan. So I didn't know the picture existed, and now we may be able to get 4 or 5 of the originals, maybe.
She was regent from 1975 to 1977.
And this picture, according to this, was taken the 4th of June, 1975. And it's, like I said, she's got all the people named in it, and a lot of them came from Texas. And but anyhow, Sarah was a daughter of Henry Moore's. According to this, was a lieutenant in the Revolutionary War.
And what we call a real daughter.
A real daughter. So, and I want you to notice her tombstone. This marble, the lid is almost 3 inches thick. I had 4 guys out here that looked like they were weightlifters. They couldn't lift it. We managed to level up the bottom, and they scooted the lid in place. But that's how heavy that lid. Now, how they got this in here? She dies in 1857.
I had to come in by way.
Well, we might have some mules, dead mules buried in here then too also. I wanted to bring this up. James Higgins and his wife Nancy, when they came in here, they had a son that's about maybe 1 to 3 years old. And their son was named Owen W. Higgins. Owen would have been brought up here. Owen, when he first bought land right up here on the north side of the Trigg farm. But Owen later on moved down and bought what we know as the Stewart Bivens farm. And Owen Higgins is buried in Mrs. Bivens' front yard. And I think that needs to be noticed too, since we have, Owen had a son named George W. Higgins. George W. Higgins, based on my research, would have been born up here at Owen's place right north of here. George W. became the captain of the Norris Creek Guards in the Civil War. And George is buried now at Rose Hill. But the Higgins, they were all, quite famous. I want to tell one quick story about James Higgins. I tell this to young people and they're amazed. But in 1812, James was on a jury in Fayetteville. And they had accused this young man of stealing a pig in 1812. Now you must realize stealing a pig may have kept a family alive for the winter. Well, I know it was a white young man because he had 2 names. So anyhow, they found him guilty of stealing the pig. So the judge sentenced this young man. Here's what the court records say. Take him down to the whipping post, which was built beside the jail. Take his shirt off, tie his hands to the whipping post. It was built like an old swing, 2 posts and a top going across. They said, tie him to the whipping post, take his shirt off, and give him 39 lashes. And then the judge says, after that, put him in jail till the pig's paid for. And I'm not, you hear jokes about that, but that's court records at Miss Sherry's archives. So I tell young people that, and it's like, maybe they wouldn't steal too much, right? Little George Leffridge here, we share the same birthday, October the 29th, but he's got me by a few years. This is Ann J. Whitaker. She was the daughter of James and Sarah. This is the line, Sarah and James and Ann J. and George. That's the line that Miss Carolyn came up through. The first wife, James Higgins, and his first wife, Nancy, that's the great-great-great-grandparents of Charles Higgins. Mr. George here lived to be quite an older man, but he had a son. This is the first Whitaker boy, and he was only in his 30s, and he died. The boys all had heart problems, and they all seemed to die young. So inside the fence, when I was a kid, I always thought that that was the main Whitaker because they had the big tombstone. As a child, you go for, the size and the everything. I didn't realize that George and James were the main ones. But this is H.R. Whitaker and his wife, Pink Ray Whitaker. Now, here's something interesting. If y'all met my cousin Linda, Linda's daughter now lives in the house that Aunt Pink lived in on North Main. And we have pictures of Aunt Pink, quite a couple of them. But it's interesting because Aunt Pink also lived in the house south of here that I grew up in. So Aunt Pink, I mean, she's my favorite because she lived for many, many years in the same houses that was in my family and now in Linda's family. And when she was very old, she went to Lookout Mountain and died, and they brought her back. So she's the last one buried in this cemetery.
You can also see how the prosperity waxed and waned in the family by the size of the...
Yes, yes.
And how did she get the first name Pink?
That was what she was named, and I'm finding quite a few people in those days named Pink. But let me tell you something about Aunt Pink. Does anybody know where Jim Cashin and lives on Mulberry? Okay, in the back of his house is a very large cemetery. Aunt Pink's parents and grandparents are buried in his backyard, and they were blacksmiths. And it's interesting because Pink would have been born and raised there at that place, and she's born in 1850. So her parents and grandparents go way back. So it's nice to be able to fit all of them together, know where they were born and where they were raised. And I even have a church record. Aunt Pink was 16 years old when she was baptized into the Baptist church, and I have a record of that from old church records at Mulberry. And we even have George here. George here was baptized when he was about 16 or 17, and he was born in 1812. And we have a record. I mean, that's just neat to be able to know they're pretty much her life story.
Wayne, when you came in here, was this fence in as good a shape as it is right now?
No, ma'am. It had bends in it, and I haven't done anything to the outside of it, but we did straighten it up some. And I want to mention Aunt Pink's footstone. I just found that recently. That was totally under the ground, and I was digging up a few months ago. I was digging up a vine and hit that top of that stone and brought it up. And I was really surprised because I had dug around looking for it, but see, hers is further closer to the monument. But this monument, the large monument, was the only monument that was still in place when I started this. Everything else was in pieces or under the ground. This marker here, the large one, was leaning. I dug a hole out underneath this north side, and I bought rented a heavy-duty jack. And I put it under there and jacked it up to level it, because if that ever fell, I don't think we could ever move it. Now, her husband was H.R. Whitaker. H.R. would love this event. H.R. was an outgoing person. He'd go to Fayetteville every week, and the first thing he would hit would be the Fayetteville Observer. And they put his name in the newspaper, and they called him the King Bee of Narsh Creek. And he really enjoyed, I think, going to the newspaper.
Was Pink a Higgins before she was...
No, Pink was a Ray. That's her last name.
I see it. R-H-E-A.
Yes, yes. And like I said, all the Rays are buried on the Cashin place down there. But now I will give you a tie-in. Pink's mother was Nancy Whitaker, who happened to be a sister to old George here.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to tell you a story. Maybe she'll forgive me. Aunt Pink, if you'll notice, Ann J dies in 1865, okay? She dies in 65. Aunt Pink's mother dies the same year. Aunt Pink is 15 years old. George is left with 5 children without a wife, and the oldest one was 15, and that was John J over here. So he had them 15 down. So Aunt Pink came out here to take over as head of the house for George, her uncle, okay? Now here's where it gets interesting. So she's raising most of the little kids. One of them she's raising, Aunt Pink was raising H.R. Whitaker, who was only 7 at the time, and she's 15, okay? Now, if you're 15 and you got a 7-year-old, you're his mama, as far as I'm concerned. Well, then later on, and she's first cousins, okay? And then several years later, she married him. So I guess she raised him the way she wanted to, and then she could marry him.
A smart woman.
But I found all this out. Miss Carolyn knew it, but she didn't tell me that. I had to kind of dig that out myself. I'm saying, well, wait a minute, you know. And she said, yeah, I just don't like to talk about it much. But actually, just food for thought. James Higgins, when he came in with Nancy, Nancy was his first cousin. So she was a Higgins, married a Higgins. And if you look at the original court records in 1810 through 12, they came in with her 2 brothers. George W. Higgins was a lawyer, and he's in the record books from day one, selling lots in Fayetteville and selling slaves, but he lived right here. So all the Higgins lived probably under one roof. The other Higgins brother was Robert Higgins. Robert Higgins was the justice of the peace, and he's in the court records. Well, he resigns in 1812, and we find out later he resigned the justice of peace and he went to Canada to fight the War of 1812. So he never married. But anyhow, that's the family. I want to mention Carolyn's grandfather, John J.
Right.
Yes,
Where is Aunt Pink's husband? H.R.
on the other side over here.
Okay. Okay.
I just want to mention John Jay is Miss Carolyn's grandfather, and he was born the same year as Aunt Pink, 1850. It's interesting, there's 3 people born in 1850 in this cemetery. And he dies in 1901. Now we have some photographs of these people right before they died, within a year of when they died. So you know what they look like. John Jay, him and his wife built the house that I lived in right down the road. It's gone now. But John Jay, he was right the opposite of his brother H.R. He went to town, but he wasn't too much into getting into the newspaper, so we don't know a whole lot about him. But he was the father of Ross Whitaker, who became the first veterinarian in Lincoln County. And that's Carolyn's daddy. But I'll be glad to answer any questions. And like I said, all of these rocks that I consider probably most likely slaves, and we do have a slave that they had about 15 slaves at any given time. Most of them, if you'll notice, are children because the rocks are close together. But all these rocks were under the ground. They was probably maybe 4 or 5 showing, and the others I kept digging until I found them. And
Well, how bad was the stone fence around it?
the north side was just about totally down. The entrance was totally down. This south side right in here was totally down, and it was down when I was a young boy, because I used to come in here when I was 7 or 8 or 9, and it was in this place was the cows were going through it then. So it was in bad shape. So I totally rebuilt this, but all the wall, there was areas, 4 or 5 areas on each side that I had to.
Just placed just like they did.
No,
stone by
no,
stone
no.
by stone?
I tore it down to get down to a good base, and then I became creative, and I figured this rock ought to go here. Well, I looked at it, and I figured the big rock's on the bottom, and it's actually 2 rock walls. It's actually 2 rock walls filled in with smaller rocks and kind of leaning into each other. So I figured after a while you kind of get the hang of it, and all the corners I had to rebuild, and I think they came out pretty good.
You did a wonderful job.
Well, thank you very much.
What about some of these flowers back here?
These buttercups here, when I was digging, this stone was half in the ground. And when I started digging, something started popping up. And I was down by 6, 7 inches, and I said, what is this? And it was buttercup bulbs. So these bulbs that are blooming now, and I've reset most of them, they can be traced back to 1901. And I find that interesting. And also I put out some pottery over here that I dug up. I just found that the other day. But yeah, the buttercups, I gave some to all the family members, and they took them to Maryland and to Texas, and they put them out and they bloomed this year. So they were really excited.
And how dirty were these stones? Were they pretty, a lot of moss and pretty dirty?
Most of the white marble was so black you could not read the inscriptions. I probably used pure bleach and bleached them probably 10 to 15 times to get them where you could, as you see them now. And they continue about every year. I'm going to have to probably redo that process. But I put out some red buds and a dogwood, and they bloomed this year. And I'm so glad that each year this will become prettier. As the some iris, well, we could put out some iris. I have some at the house, but I'm going to try to keep this. Miss Carolyn wanted white dogwood because white dogwoods and red buds bloom wild, and she figured she wanted to keep it pretty much what they would have seen. But if you look east and you look west, the Higgins and the Whitakers owned way back over the top of these hills. 1,000 acres is a lot of land. Anybody else got anything? If I don't know it, we'll just make it up.
So you planted 2 new trees in here.
I planted this one dogwood, and this spring, I planted last spring. This spring it had 1 bloom on it, and it was so pretty.
Oh, good.
And then the two red buds are in the corners, and they bloomed this year.
So you're adding a little bit of yourself there.
And I bought the concrete bench and put it in. This was bought with donation money from the family. I don't charge for the work that I did, and I can tell you, I spent 3 years up here, and I'm still working up here. But this is something as a kid I wanted to do. So I've got the opportunity to do something I wanted to do.
Well, from playing here as a child to now restoring it, it probably gives you a lot of pleasure.
And I felt guilty because Mom and Daddy taught me, our fence line was right here. And they said you don't cross onto other people's property. And the Hopkins lived here in those days. And I climbed the fence, and I was just hoping I wouldn't get caught because I would have gotten in trouble. I want to introduce Mr. Don Beard. He owns the land now, and without him, this wouldn't be possible. And his wife, Sheila, they keep the outside of the cemetery cut and weed-eated, and he's just been great on this, and we appreciate him so much.
And thank you for doing that.
His wife would like to be here, but she's babysitting.
So as a child, you snuck over the fence and into the cemetery, and
I would walk around, and I remembered the large tombstone, and I remembered the little 21-year-old girl over here, Janie, and I could read it. But with my mind, and I didn't know a lot then, I don't know a lot now. But I just figured everybody in here was killed in the Civil War. And I don't know why, but that, as a child, that was my thought. I didn't know when the Civil War happened.
Were they all on the ground then?
Everything, when I was a child, the fence was down really bad down in here. And the only one that was upright was the big one here.
Okay.
And the others, Janie's tombstone, it was up, but it was slanted. You got to understand, even these small ones over here, I had to totally dig up and reset. Everything in here has been dug up.
you've done a wonderful job.
And we cut, how many trees do we cut out here, Mr. Beard?
It's piled right there.
That large pile, plus I took probably that many down to my place and burned. But this, we cut out probably 15 bodocks and cedars out of here.
And then you cut over here in the corner.
Yes,
Do that.
we cut out a couple of trees over there and on the far side of the wall and opened it up in here.
These, only one standing was that big one. These were all down, as he said. And Wayne was trying his best to figure out how we could lift them things up. We didn't want to bring any heavy equipment in here or anything. Couldn't afford to get a crane or anything. So we got my brother and son in here, and they said, okay, what y'all want?
But they didn't lift Mr. Higgins's lid. We put that in place, but boy, this one here, they manhandled this one here.
Yeah.
It was in a hole. This top part was in this hole over here, half buried. And I want all of you, if you get a chance, look at the pictures in this book up here, because we have before. I put in a few before pictures, and you can see these pictures were taken at noon. But it's dark in here. But it's dark in here because the sunlight couldn't get in. And there was briars and poison oak, you name it, hedge, you name it, it was in here.
Well,
So I'm real pleased. You have to look to see before to appreciate it now.
That last storm come topped that cedar out. Now we're trying to debate as to what to do with that one.
But let me tell you something already. I was up here the other day going around. Already, I probably dug up 4 or 5 little oaks. And when I dug them up, the little acorn was still on. So with the soft ground, these are some oak trees. And you can imagine, left unattended for 10 years, you would have a forest in here. So as long as I'm able, and I'm going to try to keep the inside looking good. And Mr. Beard, bless his heart, he's been real good to keep this outside mowed.
now, are you related to anybody in here?
No, but I'll tell you what, after this many years of working with them and knowing their life story, I'm part of the family, I figure. And I come up and I talk, I'm serious. When I come up here, I say hello to every one of them, and especially Aunt Pink, because I'm just, she reminds me so much of my grandmother.
Well, we commend you for taking this on, even though you're not a relative. This was a great undertaking, and as DAR members, we appreciate your work in here, and we can see how much you have done.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. And Carolyn, she is glad, and I'm glad that these people are getting some recognition, because these were the founding fathers of Lincoln County, and they deserve to have their place in history.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful tour, and thank you so much for all of your hard work.
Thank you
We really
for coming.
appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.